Good morning, everyone. It is so good to be with you all. We are excited to have this opportunity to meet once again, this time centering our energy and our focus around climate justice. And this is a far-reaching issue that we as people of faith are deeply concerned about for many reasons. The impacts on human rights and human suffering across the world, and we feel that this is something that has obviously been part of our conversations for decades now. We've seen the way in which climate change has been affecting the most vulnerable people across the globe. And we as people of faith in this moment see an opportunity, especially as Omnia, to collaborate, to come together, to unify, and to activate our networks in calling for definitive action from the UN body in response to this ever increasing and ever changing challenge that the whole world is facing. And so today we have the opportunity to hear from a few of the experts who are on the ground, who are working both within the UN structures, but also who are helping to move along this action. And I won't go into the details in this portion of those. I'll pass it off to Bhagwan momentarily, but I just want us to take some time as we prepare our hearts and our minds to receive this message, to think about along the way this morning, what are the specific ways that you, as a member of Omnia, and the networks that you're connected with, what can you do starting today to help move this agenda forward and to help activate the people in your network to move this along? And so what are the energies that we can coalesce together, that we can form together to aid our sisters and brothers in the Pacific Islands to help move this needle forward? So I encourage you to think about that as we have these conversations, and think about the ways in which we can coordinate and work to advocate through this unique opportunity that has presented itself to us. We're ready and we're excited to dive in more fully as Omnia. And so I'm going to now pass it off to Bhagwan to take us into these conversations this morning. Thank you.
Hello, Christian. Can you hear me, Christian?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Greetings to everybody. And I want to start this short welcome note with a Native American proverb on the gift of earth. We do not inherit the earth from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children. We borrow it from our future. Climate change is no longer some far-off problem. It is happening here and now and everywhere. So we are the last people who can prevent the catastrophe on this planet Earth. We are here today to deliberate on the ways in which we can participate in the collective endeavor for fighting for the climate justice. And we know that this is our collective accountability. Today, we are fortunate to have three distinguished speakers. It is my honor to introduce Reverend James Bhagwan, the keynote speaker for today. He is the General Secretary of the Pacific Conference of Churches, accounting for 80% of Pacific human population. He is an ordained minister of the Methodist Church in Fiji, and he's a passionate advocate for ecological stewardship and climate justice, with particular focus on care for the ocean. I'm sure that you might have watched his video bite that Shanta shared today morning. And he's a sought after speaker and activist. And is honored to introduce Reverend James Bhagwan. Hearty welcome, Reverend James, to this discussion forum. Secondly, I want to introduce Solomon Yeo, a young and vibrant climate justice activist. I think he has joined. He's from Solomon Islands and a law graduate from University of South Pacific in Vanuatu. Solomon is one who has the idea to change the international law by getting the world's highest court, International Court of Justice, to issue an advisory opinion on the climate crisis. In 2019, Solomon has started a great extraordinary campaign for climate justice, particularly in Pacific Islands. And that campaign has evolved into many different initiatives like Pacific Island Students Fighting Climate Justice, an NGO. And he's a campaign director right now. Thank you, Solomon, for the great work that you are doing right now. And thank you for joining us today. Hearty welcome. And first, we will go with the keynote address by Reverend James Bhagwan for 15 minutes. I invite Reverend James. Reverend James, over to you.
It's a good idea to give a reverend an opportunity to speak first. I'll try not to make it a long sermon, but warm greetings to you all. It's a pleasure to be able to join you in this very important gathering, and thank you for the invitation. I'm speaking to you from Berlin, which is not in the Pacific at all, although if I have my way, maybe by the time I leave, there'll be a few more Pacific sensitive people. I'm still in Germany after the conclusion of the World Council of Churches Assembly in Karlsruhe. And that assembly was significant in the issue of climate change in regards to the Living Planet statement that was released. And I encourage you all, and I will share the link here for you to read the Living Planet statement, because it places us in the context of the time to act. By the next time the World Council of Churches meets in 8 years, the time to act will have passed. That's the reality that we are facing when it comes to the context of climate change. I speak today not as a leader, but really as a servant of the Pacific community, servant of our people that are the custodians of the majority of the Pacific Ocean, which is one of the lungs of the planet that produces, according to scientists, between 50 to 80% of the oxygen we breathe. And for Pacific people, a deep spirituality permeates the communities of the Pacific and is at the heart of our relationship with each other and with the environment. It's central to the way we interpret, understand, and interact with one another and with the natural world. And it shapes our indigenous knowledge into wisdom, guiding us to act with gentleness and gratitude for the abundance that surrounds us. In the Pacific, this spirituality is enhanced by Christianity and the many faith traditions of the world, which have grown their roots in our diverse Pacific communities and are shared with the vast majority of those who share our planet. And our Pacific spirituality calls us to embody a profound respect for creation as an interconnected web of life, living as a caring and resilient community and valuing well-being above profit. Our spirituality calls us to be custodians of God's household in the Pacific. It calls us to be guardians of the Blue Pacific. And this is at the heart of what we believe is the issues from which we engage on climate justice and on care for creation or care for the environment. Our indigenous spirituality and knowledge, the wisdom of our ancients who read the stars and traveled across our mighty ocean in their giant canoes millennia before European discovery and conquest, considered themselves a part of the ecosystem and not above it. And so we see this disconnection of relationship as part of the key issues when we come to the climate crisis. And this is at the heart of the global transformation really that needs to take place. I'm going to try and share my page, that would help. Share something for us just to reflect on while I speak. It's going to be good if I can go to the front page. So let me just end that. It's probably not the right screen, but anyway, if I can just think about the way in which we look at our Pacific Ocean. When we think of the Pacific, and in most people, when we open a map of the world, the Pacific are on the left and right-hand corners of the map of the world. That's how we're seen. We're on the periphery of the consciousness of the global north. And if one was to find a map that would place the Pacific in the center, it is often seen as a big blue empty space with a few dots in it. And this, I think, is part of the problem, that in this 21st century, there are still those attitudes that looked at South America, the Americas, looked at Africa, looked at Australia as terra nullius, that understanding of an empty land. And in this case, mare nullius, the empty ocean. But for us, the ocean is not empty. It is alive. It is full of life. It is full of community. It is full of biodiversity. And we do not see ourselves as small island states. I'm sure Solomon will support me in this fact that we recognize ourselves as large ocean states because of the fact that the Pacific Ocean covers so much of this planet. But at the moment where we are in the context of climate change, we are facing rising oceans, rising sea levels. We are facing extreme weather patterns. We are facing ocean degradation. And this is the challenge that we are facing. This year, in June, the Pacific Island nation of Kiribati declared a state of natural disaster. Now, in the context of climate change, the obvious thought that we would have is that this has to do with rising sea levels, the king tides that happen more and more frequently that wash over the entire surface of some of these islands from one end to the other. Or perhaps it has to do with saltwater intrusion that makes its way into the freshwater table, the very small and limited freshwater table, so that fruits and vegetables may not grow. But in fact, the natural disaster that was being declared was drought. So we are facing not only rising sea levels, we are facing droughts, we're facing floods, we're facing extreme weather patterns in terms of intense tropical cyclones. Category 5 is now our standard, which was once an extreme level in terms of measuring cyclones. That is our norm. And I'm sure Jerusha, who's online, can attest to that, having lived through a few cyclones during her time in Fiji. Within all of this, our resilience is something that I call attention to, that Pacific Islanders are not playing the victim card. We are resilient people, but at the same time, we do not want our resilience to be an excuse for inaction on the global sphere in terms of climate justice. There is a phrase that has been coined, our young Pacific climate warriors. We are not drowning, we are fighting. And so Solomon, who joins us today, is one of those Pacific climate warriors, one of those warriors who says on behalf of our young people and all of our people, all of our generations, that we are not drowning, we are fighting. But the fact is that we are in an ecological crisis that is a result of a moral and spiritual crisis. It is a separation of ecology and economy, which in the past, under our understanding of oikos, the whole inhabited earth, was one common understanding. Many indigenous communities and spiritualities still understand and try to practice this. But somewhere along the line, something has broken down. We experience not sustainable development. And with only 8 years to go before the achievement of the SDGs, we are still in a context of unsustainable development. We face the issue of loss and damage, economic loss and damage in terms of what the impact of climate change is doing to our communities, and the non-economic loss and damage in terms of the physical, the social, the psychosocial, the spiritual trauma that people experience in the context of climate-induced relocation, where they have to move from their homes to other places, sometimes in the island on which they live, but more and more so moving to other countries and other islands. That is an extremely traumatic experience when there is no possibility of return because of rising sea levels. Climate-induced migration is one of the key issues that we are facing at the moment. We have already begun, as a result of what we are experiencing, begun to develop frameworks for mass migration of communities, internally and externally. What does that mean for an entire nation that has to disappear, that has to move and still maintain identity? What does that mean about sovereignty? Developing countries, as a result of climate change, are being driven further into debt. Already they're in debt because they have to take loans to do development work. And now, because of the lack of movement on climate financing and the fact that instead of being given grants to deal with the issues of climate change, they're being given loans. Countries are being driven further and further into debt, putting them at risk of unscrupulous developers, putting them at risk in the context of the geopolitical situation that we see at the moment, especially between the US and its allies on one side and China on the other, and putting them at risk to guarantee the basic human rights of a right to healthy and sustainable environment. And of course, Solomon will speak more to this when he talks about the advisory opinion being sought. What we find is that there is nothing less than a transformation of society that is required. Pope Francis, in Laudato Si, his encyclical, talks about the ecological conversion. What we have seen and what we have tried to do in the Pacific is develop an ecological framework for development, which resonates with indigenous spiritual communities. It also understands and takes into account the thinking that long-term business, this type of development, an ecological framework for development makes sense because there is no such thing as infinite economic growth, especially with finite resources. We're also trying to address the issue of just transition. So while we talk about reducing and phasing out fossil fuel, ensuring that there is a clear understanding of what alternative energy requires, that it does not take into account more degradation of land and ocean resources in the need to dig up more things to shift us. But what it perhaps means is that instead of measuring our development from a GDP or an economic perspective, we really need to start to shift to look at life from a well-being perspective. Some of the wealthiest countries in the world have the highest issues of mental health. Some of them, the non-communicable diseases, cancer, etc., are a sign that not only is there an ecological crisis, this crisis is revealing itself in human beings. And so we are calling for a shift from looking at development that is only based on economics and money to one that takes into account well-being, a totality of well-being. So one that is also ecologically based in terms of well-being. We already see some countries starting to practice this in how they measure development. And, you know, I take my hat and again salute to Vanuatu that is not only supporting the AO and championing this to the UN, but also in terms of including well-being as a development indicator. New Zealand is not far behind also and placing a lot of emphasis on well-being. There's a lot of work that is being done. There is the call for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. There is work to look at ecocide as an international crime as well. And of course, what our young students from the Pacific Islands have shown is possible through the development of this advisory opinion. I will leave it there because there's also Levi and Solomon to share their perspectives, but I thank you for this opportunity. There is much work to be done and there is work for all of us to do. Thank you and God bless you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to I'm going to enter into the conversation here for a moment with Baiju's permission. Dr. Baiju Marcos leads our interfaith peacemaker team that works on climate justice. There was so much information and material in Reverend James Bhagwan's presentation that we felt like it is important to take a moment and have some of you respond or some of you ask questions of clarification. We might simply take about 5 minutes for that, not much more than that. But if you all have any things that you want to ask Reverend Bhagwan before we move to the next part, because the next part is really much more practical in terms of what we are going to do about this. But there's so much conceptual stuff that Reverend Bhagwan presented to us that it might be useful to take a moment to reflect on that. So please take a moment to raise any question or comment that you have to James Bhagwan right now. You all may unmute yourself and speak, and those who are not speaking, stay muted, please. It might be a question or it might be a comment. If you have the opportunity to do that, please do.
Very quickly, thank you for the presentation. Really stunning what you've said. What is the tactic you are going to follow in order to spread the word of the crisis you are facing in the Pacific Islands? What's the strategy of raising consciousness about this?
Thank you, Larry. I think we have been raising this issue for the last 2 decades. Pacific communities have been talking about this for 20 years now. And often what we find is that in the global north, other issues take precedence. We were making headway on the issues of climate justice, and then the corona pandemic happened. And no denying that that was an important issue, but climate issues got placed to the side. And while we were focusing on the pandemic, the climate continued to change. The focus now is on the Russia-Ukraine war. And while we focus on that, climate change continues to take place. At what point do we start to say that this is an important issue? This is not only something, and here I want to say that it's all well and good from us from the Pacific to share what is happening in our region, but there is no country, no continent that is spared from this. Just last week, look at what's happening in Pakistan. Look at what is happening in the Horn of Africa. Look at what is happening in Europe, in the US, in Australia. Climate change is happening in every single part of the world today. The question is, what are we going to do about it? And when are we going to start to see that unless we change the way we live, this will just continue to exacerbate? And we're already at the tipping point. There are 425 new fossil fuel projects, which we call carbon bombs, which are ready to be approved and in the process of being approved around the world, which will take us to twice the amount of carbon emissions we need to reduce. So we will be well over the tipping point in the next few years if nothing is done. Yet there is still hesitancy to address this issue. And this is when we start to say that every single individual has a role to play, either in your votes or the way you spend your money. And so, again, I'm mindful that I might be preaching here, and I'm not the homiletics person, that's Jerusha. This is an existential issue for the entire planet, but not everyone is seeing it that way. Thank you, Larry.
Thank you,
follow up real quickly. Is nonviolent action being considered? Nonviolent direct action.
That has been done in many places.
Okay.
And the question is, whose role is it to take action? We in the Pacific, we are doing what we can. The entire region has changed the way it does development. The new 2050 strategy for Pacific Islands, which is their combined development strategy for the next 30 years, brings all of these things into account, looks at the radical shifts that need to take place. And if we look at, again, and I will share the WCC statement that was released at the Assembly this year, I think that places a lot of things on what communities can do, whether they're Christian communities or other faith communities, and what each nation needs to do in terms of stepping up. So I will share that. But that's what the Fridays for Future marches are. That's what Ende Kalender here in Germany is doing when they storm open pit dirty coal mines. People are trying to do what they can, but I think the smartest nonviolent action you can take is to use and shift the way in which we spend our money, particularly in terms of divestment.
Thank you, James. Renee, you had your hand up, and that will be the last intervention before we go to Solomon. Thank you, Renee. Please.
Thank you. As an American Catholic, when you mention Pope Francis, what comes to mind to me is that our tendency as American Catholics is to be much more connected to American capitalism than it is to Catholicism. And I think, you coming from the World Council of Churches gathering, I guess my question is, how do we take a stand so that in these leadership groups, we do things like force discussions about investments, look at, or I guess maybe the question is, what can we do to hold people to accountability for the faith that we claim, whether it's Christianity or any other faith, rather than allowing for kind of this mediocrity because we don't want to take the boat, we don't want to annoy anybody, and we don't want, people that have money to criticize. And that's certainly my opinion, but that's been my local experience often, that we're willing to talk about recycling, but we're not willing to get at the real issues that are going to make a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. We all focus on not using plastic straws, but we're happy to exploit the environment in other ways. I think this is the biggest challenge, particularly in America, because and in all large countries, because there are major domestic issues that come at us front and center. I think one of the key things is that, for example, right now we're in the season of creation from the 1st of September to the 4th of October, which is St. Francis of Assisi feast day for the Catholics. I think making use of liturgy spaces is a very good option. But again, I think it needs to be more than that. So one of the things we're calling for is for not just at global and national church level, but at local congregations, there needs to be a major shift. And the use of Bible studies or other material, depending on which faith community is involved, I think that's an important aspect, because we've got to get people to the heart of the issue and get that transformation done. And unfortunately, it's person by person until we get some big mobilization. But that can happen. We've seen it in the Me Too movement and the Black Lives Matter. It's a matter of sticking with it and getting the ball rolling. Thank you.
Thank you, James. I'm going to move on because we have a specific agenda in front of us, and that is, now that we have had a broad picture from Reverend Bhagwan, I want to go to Solomon Yeo, who is the instigator of this particular action at the UN. And we are thinking as a interfaith peacemaker team based on climate justice, we are thinking that this might be an urgent, relevant, and winnable project for us to undertake, given the resources we have. So, and supporting this and getting people's endorsement around this issue might be the thing that we ought to do. Solomon, would you share with us what this action actually is and what it means? You're muted. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shanta. And Vinaka Vakalevu Talatala. I can see you're still very razor sharp with your interventions, and much respect and appreciation for your continuous support to our Avaka journey to the world's highest court. Folks, thank you all for having your time to join us here. For those who do not know, my name is Solomon Yeo. I am the campaign director of the Pacific Island Student Fighting Climate Change, the youth-led organization from the Pacific that somehow through their research have reignited the quest to take the world's biggest problem to the world's highest court, the International Court of Justice, and currently working alongside Pacific civil society and Pacific governments and global big international NGOs as well, and trying to push forward for this campaign. So that's just a bit background on where this stands. I will not go through in detail with that, but just directly into what was requested, the International Court of Justice Advisory Opinion on Climate Change. I understand that it's a very complex campaign, but the simplest way I can explain to lay people who do not really dwell much deeper into the law is a story from the Pacific, which I would like to share with you all. And some of our societies again, majority of the society in the traditional society in the Pacific, whenever we have a very concerning problem that our community face, we often have to go and that we don't have the clear directions and answers to, we go to the highest authoritative figure to give us direction, and that is the chief. So what would the villagers do? We'll go up to the chief and then ask him for his opinion, saying that, Chief, we have this problem. What is your advice? You as the custodian and guardian of the customary laws, traditions, practices, you, great chief, what would you advise us to do in this circumstance? What is our obligations as villagers to ensure that we address this problem? The chief, of course, will then look back in history, look back in law, look back at their practices, and draw from every one of that and say, look, villagers, to address this problem, you have these are your obligations that you need to abide to. And you would have to do this precise thing to address the problem that you're trying to address. Villagers, of course, can say, thank you, chief. Thank you for your opinion, but we decided to do the other thing. That is still an option. It's not legally, it's not binding upon them. But of course, as the highest authoritative figure and the gatekeeper of all of the traditions and law, they normally would respect the chief decisions, and in most cases would respect the chief decisions and then follow through. Of course, there are some states with some individuals in the communities would say, like, look, even though our obligations is clarified, we don't want to do it. But in general, now there is no excuse that your obligations are not vague or ambiguous. They're quite clear as clarified by the chief. And also it gives you a sense of direction of what you need to do in addressing a problem. That is the simplest way I can simplify what we're trying to seek in an advisory opinion, International Court of Justice advisory opinion, climate change. We're not trying to point fingers, name, shame, or blaming in states. It's just merely seeking a process. Advisory opinion, as you hear, is just an advice, a sacred advice given by the International Court of Justice by clarifying the obligations of states under international law to protect the rights of the current and future generations from the adverse effects of climate change. So in this days, as we can see in Atala Talameli's intervention, political will is not there. And I think one major barrier that political will is not there is because states deliberately or do not know what their obligations are under international law to commit and contribute towards our collective effort to address climate change. So in this sense, that's why we're seeking assistance from the International Court of Justice to provide their guidance to ensure that these obligations are clarified and states follow through with them. And of course, when these obligations are clarified, their own citizens be able to hold them accountable to say that, look, the ICJ has made clear that these are your obligations under international law. You need to follow through, not because we really want to put you in a lot of pressure. Is that this problem in the whole history of the Homo sapiens, entire civilization, is the biggest problem that we face so far to this date, according to one very one of the lawyers who stated this. Was the lead counsel for the Vanuatu government. He stated the fact that this is a problem that is the magnitude is too big, and that of course we understand that economy is at stake and we have other interests, domestic and national interests, but we really need to understand that climate change will be the end game for our whole entire civilization. So what we need to do is to make deep cuts, and these deep cuts would mean we need to follow through with obligations. And this is why citizens really need to ensure that their governments are accountable for their actions. How do we do that? There's a lot of roadblocks, of course, domestic law, even at the approaches that we take to climate change, of course, seeing it just a political or technical issue. But in our case, from the Pacific Island students writing climate change, when we started, we see that climate change is really a human rights issue, as Reverend Bhagwan has highlighted in the cases there we're facing in the Pacific, where you have issue of the even basic human rights are not being able to follow through, land rights are being depleted away, and so many other things. And you can see that this is not just in the Pacific now; it's now all throughout the world. The human rights of people are really under the fire at the moment here. It's because and people start to see that this climate crisis is becoming a human rights crisis. So it's already a human rights crisis. So how can we really ensure that our approaches to tackling climate change is through human rights based approaches? So in this case, what we're trying to do here is to seek this advice opinion campaign. So from the Pacific, the campaign has left back in July. From the great efforts of Pacific civil society and young people in our region who managed to work alongside our governments in ensuring that they endorse the International Court of Justice advisory opinion and bring it forward to the international states to convince other states. Because in order to get the advisory opinion through the United Nations General Assembly route, you would need a simple majority vote. So that is why governments and civil society around the world now are trying to encourage their own respective governments and saying that, look, you need to make a stand on this. This is a very important problem. It's a very important initiative. What is your thoughts on it? You can vote yes, no, or abstention on this when it comes to the United Nations. But making sure that this is something that we all really want to go through, as this is an avenue that we have not yet considered very seriously. So in order to get this, as I said, you need a simple majority vote. When the time comes, Vanuatu will table a resolution at the United Nations General Assembly, in which all states will have the opportunity to vote yes on this, vote on this. So this is the task that we're all left with to do. And there are some ways in which actions that we can share that civil society and ordinary individuals can take to ensure that we can achieve this goal.
Thank you, Solomon.